Microeconomics, Perloff, Chapter 2, Supply and Demand, Supply Elasticities over time. Short-run supply curve elasticities may differ from the long-run elasticities. If a manufacturing firm wants to increase production in the short run, it can do so by hiring workers to use its machines around the clock. However, how much it can expand its output is limited by the fixed size of its manufacturing plant and the number of machines it has. In the long run, however, the firm can build another plant and buy or build more equipment. Thus, we would expect a firm's long-run supply elasticity to be greater than it is in the short run. Adelaha, 1991, found that the short-run supply elasticity of milk is 0.36, whereas the long-run supply elasticity is 0.51. Thus, the long-run quantity response to a 1% increase in price is about 42%, open bracket, equals, open parentheses, 0.51 minus 0.36, close parentheses, divided by 0.36, more than it is in the short run. Application: oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We can use information about demand and supply elasticities to answer an important public policy question. Would selling oil from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, substantially affect the price of oil? Established in 1980, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge covers 20 million acres and is the largest of Alaska's 16 national wildlife refuges. It is believed to contain massive deposits of petroleum, about the amount consumed annually in the United States. For decades, a debate has raged over whether the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge owners and the citizens of the United States should keep it undeveloped or permit oil drilling. Superscript 16, which reads, I am grateful to Robert Wapples, who wrote an earlier version of this analysis. In the following discussion, we assume for simplicity that the oil market is competitive, and we use current values for the prices and quantities of oil, even though drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge will not take place for at least a decade. In the simplest form of this complex debate, President Obama has sided with environmentalists who stress that drilling would harm the wildlife refuge and pollute the environment, whereas former President George W. Bush and other drilling proponents argue that extracting this oil would substantially reduce the price of petroleum, as well as decrease the U.S. dependence on foreign oil and bring in large royalties. Recent spurts in the price of gasoline and the war in Iraq have heightened this intense debate. The effect of the sale of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge oil on the world price of oil is a key element in this debate. We can combine oil production information with supply and demand elasticities to make a back-of-the-envelope estimate of the price effects. A number of studies estimate that the long-run elasticity of demand, epsilon for oil, is about negative 0.4, and the long-run supply elasticity is nu. is about 0.3. Analysts agree less about how much Arctic National Wildlife Refuge oil will be produced. The Department of Energy's Energy Information Service predicts that production from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge would average about 800,000 barrels per day. That production would be about 1% of the worldwide oil production, which averaged about 84 million barrels per day from 2007 through early 2010. A report of the U.S. Department of Energy predicted that Arctic National Wildlife Refuge drilling could lower the price of oil by about 1%. Severin Borenstein, the director of the University of California Energy Institute, concluded that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge might reduce oil prices by up to a few percentage points, but that drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge will never noticeably affect gasoline prices. In the following solved problem, we make our own calculation of the price effect of drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Here, and in many of the solved problems in this book, you are asked to determine how a change in a variable or policy, such as permitting drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, affects one or more variables, such as the world equilibrium price of oil. Solved problem 2.3. What would be the effect of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge production on the world equilibrium price of oil, given that epsilon is negative 0.4 and nu is equal to 0.3? The pre-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge daily world production of oil is capital Q sub 1 equals 82 million barrels per day. The pre-ANWR world price is P sub 1 equals $50 per barrel, and daily Arctic National Wildlife Refuge production is 0.8 million barrels per day. Superscript 17. From 2007 through early 2010, the price of a barrel of oil fluctuated between about $30 and $140. The calculated percentage change in the price of this solved problem is not sensitive to the choice of the initial price of oil. We assume that the supply and demand curves are linear and that the introduction of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge oil would cause a parallel shift in the world supply curve to the right by 0.8 million barrels per day. Answer: determine the long-run linear demand function that is consistent with pre-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge world output and price at the original equilibrium epsilon sub 1 in the figure P sub 1 equals $50 and capital Q sub 1 equals 82. And the elasticity of demand is epsilon open parentheses d capital Q over dp close parentheses open parentheses P sub 1 over capital Q sub 1 close parentheses equals open parentheses d capital Q over dp close parentheses open parentheses 50 divided by 82 close parentheses equals negative 0.4. Using algebra, we find that d capital Q over dp equals negative 0.4 open parentheses 82 over 50 close parentheses equals negative 0.656, which is the inverse of the slope of the demand curve, capital D, in the figure. Knowing this slope and that demand equals 82 at $50 per barrel, we can solve for the intercept because the quantity demanded rises by 0.656 for each dollar by which the price falls. The demand when the price is 0 is 82 plus open parentheses 0.656 times 50 equals 114.8. Thus, the equation for the demand curve is capital Q equals 114.8 minus 0.656p. To determine the long-run linear supply function that is consistent with pre-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge world output and price, where capital S superscript 1 intercepts capital D at the original equilibrium E sub 1, the elasticity of supply is nu equals open parentheses D capital Q over dP close parentheses open parentheses P sub 1 over capital Q sub 1 close parentheses equals open parentheses D capital Q over dP close parentheses open parentheses 50 over 82 close parentheses equals 0.3. Solving, we find that D capital Q over dP equals 0.3 open parentheses 82 divided by 50 close parentheses equals 0.492. Because the quantity supplied falls by 0.492 for each dollar by which the price drops, the quantity supplied when the price is 0 is 82 minus open parentheses 0.492 times 15 close parentheses equals 57.4. Thus, the equation for the pre-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge supply curve is capital S superscript 1, and the figure is capital Q equals 57.4 plus 0.492p. 3. Determine the post-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge long-run linear supply function. The oil pumped from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge would cause a parallel shift in the supply curve, moving capital S superscript 1 to the right by 0.8 to capital S superscript 2. That is, the slope remains the same, but the intercept on the quantity axis increases by 0.8. Thus, the supply function for capital S superscript 2 is capital Q equals 58.2 plus 0.492p. In the figure, we have price on the vertical axis. 50 lines up with epsilon sub 1 and 49.30 lines up with epsilon sub 2. And there are two supply curves, capital S superscript 1, capital S superscript 2. And there's one demand curve. And the difference with the equilibrium is 82 and 82.46 capital Q, which is millions of barrels of oil per day. 4. Use the demand curve and the post-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge supply function to calculate the new equilibrium price and quantity. The new equilibrium E sub 2 occurs where capital S superscript 2 intersects capital D, setting the right-hand sides of the demand function and the post-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge supply function equal. We obtain an expression in the new price, P sub 2. 58.2 plus 0.492 p sub 2 equals 114.8 minus 0.656 p sub 2. We can solve this expression for the new equilibrium price. P sub 2 is approximately $49.30. That is, the price drops about 70 cents, or approximately 1.4%. If we substitute this new price into either the demand curve or the post-Arctic National Wildlife Refuge supply curve, we find that the new equilibrium quantity is 82.46 million barrels per day. That is, equilibrium output rises by 0.46 million barrels per day, open parentheses, 0.56%, close parentheses, which is only a little more than half of the predicted daily Arctic National Wildlife Refuge supply, because other suppliers will decrease their output slightly in response to the lower price. Comment: our estimate of a small drop in the world oil price if Arctic National Wildlife Refuge oil is sold would not change substantially if our estimates of the elasticities of supply and demand were moderately larger or smaller, or if the equilibrium price of oil were higher or lower. The main reason for this result is that the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge output would be a very small portion of the worldwide supply. The new supply curve would be only slightly to the right of the initial supply curve. Thus, drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge cannot insulate the American market from international events that roil the oil market. In contrast, a new war in the Persian Gulf could shift the world supply curve to the left by 3 million barrels a day or more, nearly 4 times the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge production. Such a shock would cause the price of oil to soar, whether we drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or not.